10 seconds. That's how long it takes for a diving aircraft to close the last mile of open sky between itself and a ship. Orville Bethard is standing on the flight deck of the USS St. when the count starts. He doesn't know it started. Nobody does. He's just a young electrician's mate, looking up at a lone fighter dropping out of the clouds, doing what every gunner and every deckhand on this ship has done 100 times before. Watching the pattern: level off, release the bomb, pull up, run for home. 9 seconds. The plane doesn't level off. 7 seconds. Tracer fire rips past it in glowing lines. Flak bursts open around it. Black smoke flowers in a sky that's already full of noise. Any sane pilot breaks off now. Any trained pilot breaks off now. 5 seconds. This one doesn't bank, doesn't climb, doesn't even try to survive what's coming next. 3 seconds. And that's when it hits Bethard and every man near him, all at once. This isn't a bomb run. There is no bomb run. The aircraft itself is the bomb, and the man flying it made his decision before he ever left the ground. 1 second. At 10:51 on the morning of October 25th, 1944, the aircraft slams into the flight deck of the USS St. In 30 minutes, this ship will be gone. 143 of her 889 men will go down with her, and the word the U.S. Navy learns that morning, Kamikaze, divine wind, is only the beginning. Because this tactic isn't a one-time act of desperation. It's about to become Japan's answer to an entire war it can no longer win by conventional means. And over the next 8 months, it will turn the waters around the Philippines and a small island called Okinawa into the deadliest sky the United States Navy has ever flown or fought under. This is the story of that sky, told from both sides of it. To understand why a man would fly a plane into a ship on purpose, you first have to understand what he was flying against. By 1944, the United States Navy wasn't just an armed force. It was an industrial machine, poured into steel and sent to sea. American shipyards launched escort carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Fuel followed the fleet across the Pacific, so ships never had to turn back. Even small things told the story. Fresh bread, hot food, ice cream, reaching men on islands most Americans back home couldn't find on a map. To the officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that kind of abundance wasn't just intimidating. It was proof of something worse. Japan was not losing battles anymore. Japan was losing the ability to fight battles at all. That truth became undeniable in the waters off the Philippines in the last week of October 1944, during what would become the largest naval battle in human history. Battleships were sunk. Fleet carriers were sunk. In 4 days, the surface power of the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken beyond repair. One officer watched that defeat unfold and refused to accept it as the final word. His name was Takejiro Onishi, Vice Admiral, commander of Japan's First Air Fleet. And by the 3rd week of October, he had almost nothing left to fight with. His pilots were undertrained. His planes were outdated. A conventional strike against the American fleet had almost no chance of getting through, let alone doing damage that mattered. So Onishi asked for something no Japanese commander had ever formally asked for before. Not skill, not survival. He asked for volunteers willing to fly their aircraft directly into an enemy ship and not pull up. Among the young men who said yes was a 23-year-old lieutenant named Yukio Seki. Seki wasn't a fanatic pulled from a poster. He was a trained pilot, respected by the men around him, recently married to a young woman named Mariko. When his commanding officer asked him to lead the very first organized Kamikaze unit, the Shikishima Special Attack Unit, witnesses in the room that night said he sat in silence for a long moment before answering. Then he agreed. Later, alone, he reportedly told a war correspondent that Japan was finished if it had to sacrifice pilots like him to win. He didn't say it like a man eager to die for glory. He said it like a man doing the math and not liking the answer and volunteering anyway. That contradiction. Men who didn't necessarily want to die, choosing to anyway, sat at the center of the entire Kamikaze program, hidden just underneath the ceremony built to disguise it. Before a mission, pilots shared a single cup of sake, passed hand to hand, binding each of them to the warriors who came before. Many carried a senenbari, a cloth belt stitched 1,000 times over by 1,000 different women back home. Each stitch a small prayer for a man everyone already understood wasn't coming back to say thank you. Some wrote farewell letters. A few were full of patriotic fire. Others, quieter, admitted the truth Seki had already said out loud, that they wanted to live, that they were going anyway. Japan's wartime government didn't hide any of this. It broadcast it to a public running out of ships, out of victories, out of good news to print. The Kamikaze pilot became something the propaganda machine could sell as strength instead of desperation, not a sign that Japan had run out of machines. Proof, they claimed, that spirit could still defeat steel, even when steel alone no longer could. It was a strange, brutal kind of honesty wrapped inside a lie. Japan admitted, without quite admitting it, that it had lost the Industrial War. And it offered the one thing American engineering could never fully calculate for in return. A man who had already decided how the fight was going to end before it started. On the morning of October 25th, Yukio Seki carried that decision into the sky over Samar, aiming first for the escort carrier White Plains. Anti-aircraft fire forced him off course mid-dive. He found a new target instead. The USS St. hadn't even finished the fight it was already in. Minutes earlier, Taffy 3, a small, lightly armored task unit never built to face a major fleet, had somehow held off the surviving core of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. Destroyers charged battleships. Escort carriers launched everything they had, even after running out of bombs, just to keep enemy gunners looking the wrong way. By late morning, the Japanese force was retreating. For a few minutes, the men of Taffy 3 allowed themselves to believe the worst of the day was behind them. Then, radar picked up incoming aircraft, and Seki 0 began its dive toward the St. At 10:51, it struck the flight deck. The bomb it carried punched through into the hangar below, where planes were being armed and refueled at that exact moment. Aviation fuel caught fire. The fire found the ship's magazine. Then the Senectot tore itself apart from the inside, one explosion feeding the next, 6 times over, in front of every man still standing on deck. Within 30 minutes, she was gone, rolling onto her side, sliding under the water in a column of black smoke that men on nearby ships would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The USS St. became the first major American warship ever sunk by a kamikaze attack. She would not be the last, not close. Minutes before St. went down, the escort carrier Santi had already been hit by a kamikaze of its own. A young seaman named Mac Mileski was standing near the bridge when it happened. He would say, decades later, that he hadn't understood what he was looking at until the moment of impact. A plane on fire, diving, and simply refusing to turn away. That gap, the half second between watching something impossible and believing it, became the real weapon hidden inside the kamikaze tactic. American gunners had trained for years against a predictable enemy. A pilot who wanted to live broke off an attack under heavy fire. That instinct was built into every manual, every drill, every reflex behind a 20mm mount. Kamikaze pilots shattered that rule completely. No wall of tracer fire guaranteed a turnaway. Sometimes a solid hit only meant the plane crashed a few seconds sooner, and often just as close. So the gunners had to learn something new. In the middle of combat, with no time to process it, keep firing, keep tracking, keep believing accuracy still mattered, even against a man who had already decided the fight's outcome before it began. It's easy, from a distance of 80 years, to talk about this as a tactical problem. It wasn't only that. It was 3,000 men at a time, standing at open gun mounts, watching a sky that no longer played by the rules they'd trained under, and choosing, every single time, not to run. The Navy's own after-action reports would later call it one of the most difficult anti-aircraft problems the fleet had ever faced, not because the tactic was clever, because it broke a psychological contract every gunner had relied on just to keep loading the next shell. Leyte was supposed to be the exception. It became the opening chapter. Within weeks, kamikaze attacks intensified during the invasions of Mindoro and Leyte Gulf, sinking dozens of ships and damaging dozens more. What had started as one admiral's desperate improvisation was fast becoming official doctrine across the entire Imperial Navy. And then Japan looked at a map and understood exactly what was coming next. Okinawa sat less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. If it fell, American bombers and an eventual invasion force would be standing on Japan's own doorstep. This was no longer a fight for a distant colony. This was the last line before home. So Japan committed to defending it with a scale of kamikaze warfare the world had never seen. Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, sent wave after wave of mass suicide attacks against the fleet, ringing the island. 10 major waves, some throwing hundreds of aircraft at the Americans in a single push, spread across nearly 3 months of fighting that never fully stopped, day or night. The United States Navy knew this was coming. It had already started building an answer. The core of that answer was something the Navy called the radar picket line, a ring of destroyers and smaller ships pushed far out from the main fleet, some stationed nearly 100 miles from Okinawa itself, watching the sky so the ships that mattered most would have warning before the ships that mattered most were ever seen. It was a brutally simple idea, and it worked, in the sense that it kept the big carriers and battleships alive. It worked because the picket destroyers paid for that protection with their own hulls. Japanese pilots, often undertrained and flying obsolete aircraft, tended to attack whatever ship they saw first. At Okinawa, that was almost always a picket destroyer, standing alone at the edge of the formation, radar mast turning, crew watching a horizon that could turn deadly at any second of any hour. Of the roughly 100 destroyers assigned to picket duty, 10 were sunk outright. More than 30 were damaged badly enough to end their part in the war. Small landing craft assigned to support them were hit again and again, almost by design, buying the fleet a few extra minutes of warning at a price paid entirely in someone else's blood. The Navy's response wasn't to pull back, it was to reinforce. A single destroyer on station became 2. Landing craft were added purely for extra anti-aircraft fire. Fighter direction teams were embedded on the pickets themselves, so combat air patrols could be vectored straight into an incoming raid before it ever reached the fleet. And on the technical side, American engineers leaned into the one advantage Japan could never copy: precision, manufactured at scale. The 5-inch gun, paired with a new invention called the proximity fuse, became the single most effective weapon against kamikaze attacks. It didn't need a direct hit to bring a plane down. It only needed to pass close enough to detonate on its own, tearing the aircraft apart with shrapnel before it ever reached its dive. Look at what that really means, for a moment. Japan had removed the need for accuracy from its pilots by turning the aircraft itself into the pit. America answered by building a weapon that no longer needed a human being to be accurate either. 2 navies, solving the same problem from the opposite directions, one by removing the pilot's fear, the other by removing the gunner's need to aim. And still, through the spring of 1945, the ships kept burning. If there is one single afternoon that shows exactly what this war in the sky had become, it's May 11th, 1945, aboard the fleet carrier USS Bunker Hill. By this point in the campaign, Bunker Hill's crew were veterans of this new kind of fear. They had watched other carriers get hit. They knew the drill, the klaxon, the mad scramble to general quarters. What they didn't know, what nobody could have prepared them for, was what was about to happen in the next 30 seconds. At around 10 o'clock that morning, a single zero broke through the combat air patrol and the wall of anti-aircraft fire surrounding the carrier. It struck the flight deck, its bomb punching through into the crowded ranks of fully fueled, fully armed aircraft parked below. Fire exploded across the deck almost instantly, black smoke rolling up hundreds of feet into the clear morning sky. Before damage control teams could even begin to answer that first fire, a second kamikaze appeared. It had been trailing the first the entire time, using the chaos and the smoke as cover. 30 seconds after the first impact, the second aircraft hit. In half a minute, Bunker Hill had absorbed 2 direct kamikaze strikes. Fire tore through the flight deck, the hangar bay, and multiple compartments below. Men fought those fires for hours, some of them trapped by flame and smoke in spaces they'd walked through 100 times before, without a second thought. By the time the fires were finally brought under control, close to 400 men were dead or missing. Hundreds more were wounded. Bunker Hill survived. She would never fight again in this war, but she survived. Proof that even the Navy's most devastating losses of the entire campaign weren't always fatal to the ship itself, only to the men who happened to be standing in the wrong compartment when the second plane found its mark. A month earlier, a different kind of horror had already shown up on radar screens near a picket station off Okinawa. The destroyer, USS St. Abele had just survived a hit from a conventional kamikaze when a second contact appeared, closing far faster than any propeller aircraft ever could. It was an Oka, a rocket-powered, human-guided flying bomb, carried most of the way to its target under the wing of a larger aircraft, and released to make its own unstoppable final run. The Oka struck Abele near the waterline. The explosion broke the destroyer's back. She sank in minutes, taking 84 sailors with her. By the time organized resistance on Okinawa finally ended in June of 1945, the totals were almost too large to hold in your head at once. Roughly 1,500 kamikaze sorties flown against the fleet. More than 3,000 American sailors dead or missing. Over 6,000 wounded. Dozens of ships sunk. Hundreds more damaged. Some of them, like Bunker Hill, never fit to fight. And on the other side of that terrible arithmetic, thousands of young Japanese pilots, most of them barely out of their teens, many of them university students only months earlier, never came home either. Some had believed every word of the propaganda that sent them up. Many, like Yukio Seki, almost certainly hadn't. There's a strange symmetry buried inside this entire campaign, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close. America fought this war with logistics, radar, proximity fuses, and an industrial base capable of replacing almost anything the fighting took from it. Japan fought it with the one resource that no factory could manufacture and no amount of American steel could fully counter: human will, weaponized, aimed, and released. One pilot, one aircraft, one decision at a time. Neither side ever completely solved the other's method. American gunners got faster, better coordinated, more lethal with every week that passed, and still couldn't stop every kamikaze from getting through. Japan sent everything it had left into the sky over Okinawa, wave after wave, and still couldn't stop the island, or the war, from being lost. What the kamikaze campaign actually changed wasn't the outcome of the Pacific War. That outcome had already been decided in the industrial gap laid bare at Leyte Gulf. What it changed was the price. The number of men, on both sides, who had to die to finish what October 25, 1944, had already made inevitable. Orville Bethard made it home from that morning off Samar. He carried the sight of the St. going under for the rest of his life, a ship, a crew, and a rule about how wars were supposed to be fought, all sinking together in the same 30-minute. Yukio Seki never got the chance to carry anything home at all. Somewhere off the coast of Samar, the wreck of the USS St. still rests on the ocean floor, the first casualty of a tactic that would go on to reshape naval warfare for the rest of the century that followed her. Her crew didn't know, in that first terrible half hour, that they were living through the opening chapter of one of the most harrowing campaigns of the entire Pacific War. They only knew what every sailor who came after them would eventually understand: that the horizon they'd trusted their whole lives, the one that used to just mean open sky and open sea, now meant something else entirely: a horizon of fire. Closing in, one dive at a time, and no way to know until the very last second, whether the man behind the controls was planning to pull up at all. If you're watching this from somewhere the war never reached, take a second before. Somewhere out there right now, someone watching this exact video is sitting in a country their grandfather's ship once sailed toward, or away from, back in 1945. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. This channel exists to keep stories like this one from disappearing into the dark. Subscribe and stay with us for the next one.